Hello and welcome to a new edition of The Big Picture, the show where we try to take you behind and beyond news events to understand the larger forces which are driving them. This has been a busy period for Indian foreign policy. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in the United States with bilateral engagements lined up with President Donald Trump. He's also going to address the United Nations General Assembly. Last week, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar addressed a press conference outlining the achievements of the government in its first 100 days in office. He also revealed the key conceptual thinking of the government which has driven its foreign policy. Pakistan, of course, continues with its polemics, bordering on war rhetoric against India after the move in Jammu and Kashmir. To discuss the key strands of Indian foreign policy today, I'm joined by a very distinguished guest. Vivek Katju is a former ambassador, a former retired Indian Foreign Service officer. He, for a long time, handled the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran desk at the Ministry of External Affairs. He also served as ambassador to several countries, including Afghanistan. He is a distinguished commentator and often writes columns for the Hindustan Times. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Pleasure.
Let me begin by asking you a slightly conceptual question. In Modi's second term, what is it that is driving this government's foreign policy, and what are the key drivers that you can see which undergird their actions?
I heard Jaishankar's press conference with some care. And I get the impression that the major focus would be on how to put India within the matrix of the geopolitical shifts that are taking place in the world, the rebalancing that is in progress on account of the rise of China. It's not an easy task, but I think between Modi and Jaishankar, there would be an attempt at finding what used to be called in the old days India's rightful place in the Comity of Nations.
You spoke about rebalancing. A key relationship that India has is with the United States. We have seen some discord over the past few months on two issues. One is trade. The other was when President Trump offered to mediate between India and Pakistan. But what we are also seeing now is a degree of warmth between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. How would you describe the state of India-US relations? And are we looking at convergence, or are there still areas of divergence that we need to worry about?
For a person like me who served in the United States in our embassy in the US in Washington in the mid-80s, and incidentally Jaishankar and I were colleagues in the embassy at that stage, the Indo-US relations today are absolutely and fundamentally different than they were in the Cold War. So it's a pleasant thing to follow them as they are progressing, and clearly the US today understands that with the rise of India, the rise of China is often spoken of, but there is a rise of India, and that with the rise of India, it is in the US's interest, as indeed it is in ours, to cement this relationship and make this multifaceted. In an attempt to do so, naturally there will be areas where our interests diverge. Trade, you mentioned, I think Trump has this feeling that there should be a balance of trade and that America should lessen the trade gap. I'm not fazed by that. I think trade will move ahead and will find its own balance. As it is, we have a balance of trade in our favor. We are focused on acquiring American technology, which we need, and that is an area of some interest as we'll progress further. As far as other issues are concerned, I think when it comes to India's western neighborhood, there is a fundamental convergence in approaches. I think the Americans understand what is brewing in Pakistan and Afghanistan. In fact, they faced what is happening in Afghanistan. It's not been a happy experience for them. So much of what we used to tell them in the past, they've experienced themselves today. And while they have their own compulsions, I think the two countries are doing quite well there. The warmth in the relationship, yes, of course, there is a warmth which is driven by this coincidence of interests and a realization that as the Indo-Pacific evolves, India and the US have much business to do with each other, but there is also the warmth based on the personalities of leaders, and that is coming to the fore. That is something that we've been witnessing.
Let me just take you on the second point you made about our western neighborhood. There has been some criticism of this government's approach, and that criticism suggests that after a lot of diplomatic effort, India had succeeded in dehyphenating itself from Pakistan and was treated as a separate case. Its recent moves, have they created a situation where the US in particular now has rehyphenated India and Pakistan?
I don't see that as happening. I see that when the US or other major powers perceive that there are tensions and growing tensions between India and Pakistan, they naturally get engaged. And they get engaged simultaneously with both sides. That engagement does not mean a rehyphenation. The engagement with India is qualitatively different. India has made it clear that it will not accept any US or any other country's mediation when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir or any other aspect of Indo-Pak relations. But engagement and mediation are different.
Let me move to Pakistan. It's close to 2 months since the government engineered its moves on Kashmir. Pakistan has been very angry. It is, you wrote a piece for the Hindustan Times where you talked about the new Pakistani narrative which it is creating about India, projecting it as a fascist country in the grips of a fascist political leader. Where is Pakistan today after 50 days of strenuous diplomatic effort? Has it succeeded in cornering us, or is it now on the back foot?
I think as Imran Khan is going to or is in America, he would be really a very disappointed man because he has very little to show, and the Pakistani establishment has very little to show for all the narrative that they've been trying to build. They didn't succeed in the UNSC. Quite clearly, they were told quite bluntly that Indo-Pak issues issues relating to J&K have to be resolved bilaterally. No one bought their narrative, except China, but that's a special case. They have failed in the UNHRC, the Human Rights Council. They couldn't even get a discussion. And in the GA, I don't think they'll have any traction. So the absence of any international traction would have disappointed them. However, they won't stop trying. They will push this narrative, especially among the liberal circles in the West and the Islamic Ummah. I don't think they'll go much. They'll succeed, but they'll certainly try.
One other instrument that Pakistan has so consistently used against us is, of course, terrorism. It sees it as leverage. It has used covert warfare. Do you see Pakistan stepping up its support for terror activities in Kashmir and even the rest of India as a response?
Prashant, in these last few weeks, ever since the constitutional changes of August 5, the Pakistanis have kept a very tight rein on their jihadist groups, both in terms of action as well as in terms of rhetoric. they haven't allowed them to come to the forefront. I think they're keeping all this in reserve, and I don't know how long they'll be able to keep this tight rein on. But at the moment, they are trying to project that what is happening in Kashmir is suo motu, that it's in the nature of a civil disobedience movement. Imran Khan has gone to the extent of saying that anyone, any Pakistani who goes for jihad in Kashmir is betraying the Kashmir cause. So if you look at all this, quite clearly they are trying to create a more moderate image, both of themselves and of the processes that are there in Jammu and Kashmir. But they are not going to abandon terrorism. They have in the past calibrated it, and that is the thing today too, when they are not giving up the infrastructure of terror, but they're keeping their boys on a hold.
Given that they have not abandoned that policy and they could resort to it at any moment they deem appropriate, and given that India now has a new normal in terms of how it responds to such attacks, we saw what happened after Pathankot, after Pulwama. Do you see the two countries moving on to an escalatory spiral of conflict over the next few years? A slightly longer term question.
I do think that if there is an unacceptable terrorist attack traced to Pakistan, then no government of India will be able to avoid some kind of kinetic action. I think that the force of public opinion will move it in that direction. The Pakistanis will respond, and therefore there is a possibility of certain steps which will involve action. The Pakistanis are now distinguishing between what they are saying are skirmishes and conventional war. And they feel that as long as they are skirmishes, there is no real danger of escalation. I think the lessons that they need to draw is that terrorism per se is much too dangerous. And I also suspect that the world is telling them that the time for terrorism is now over.
Let me move to the third big relationship that we have, which is China. The foreign minister has been using this phrase now often. He used it at his press conference last week, that it's on us to ensure that differences don't turn into disputes. Is that going to be the fundamental tenet of how we deal with tensions with China? And I ask this in the context when China has been so aggressive after our moves on Kashmir.
I think despite this aggression which China has shown, and China has been aggressive everywhere, I feel that there is a realization in Beijing that they can't push India beyond the point. Doklam is a case in point. That realization would, and the rebalancing that is taking place, I think will make them hold their hand when it comes to complete aggression. But yes, we'll have to be wary, and we will have to be alert to look after our interests. And I don't subscribe to these dictums that that there is enough space in the world for both to grow. Clearly, both sides have to find areas of cooperation, and we are doing that. But there are contentious areas, and we've got to be prepared to look after our interests in those contentious areas with the Chinese.
Is there any way we can weaken the China-Pakistan nexus, or that's beyond our leverage and abilities?
In the past, the Sino-Pak relationship was built on a shared hostility, negativity towards India. But the CPEC has added a positive pillar. I think the strategic need for Pakistan by China is now qualitatively different. And therefore, I don't see the Sino-Pak nexus being diluted at any early stage.
My final question, sir. What would be the biggest challenge for this government in the months to come on the foreign policy front?
I can't put my finger on one specific aspect. There are numerous challenges, but if I were to give a priority, I would think it is how to really secure a larger Indian footprint in the rule-making apparatuses of the world. Because Jaishankar did say that that India's voice is being heard. We've got to move beyond the voice being heard to really now become players on the tables where the big boys sit to decide the rules of global governance. And that requires a fundamental shift in thinking in the West in particular about India's position. It's going to be an arduous task, but we'll have to persevere.
Thank you so much, sir. This was a very thought-provoking and insightful conversation. Please join us next week for another edition of The Big Picture. Thank you.